There you
Hi,
are.
Laura.
Hello, Tom.
Hi. Sorry, just making a cup of tea.
Oh
How's
no, I am with you there. I thought, oh, can't do this without a cup of tea. We are also joined by Mariam. So, hello, Mariam, in the background. If you want to ask a question or jump in on the conversation, you can either pop it in the chat or you can unmute, unhide your video, and you're very welcome to join us. I leave that completely up to you.
Hi, Mariam.
Um, this is the first time we're meeting, Tom. Although I
Yes.
do kind of feel like I've been watching you for the last couple of years and seeing what you've been up to, and it's been an interesting. It's interesting because you're talking about referred pain,
Yeah.
radiculopathy, all things
Yeah.
neuropathic, and so it's been nice having somebody else, like having somebody sort of translate some of that work for us all.
Yeah. I've been endlessly going on and on about the same thing for almost maybe 3 years now. Yeah. And I think it's too late to stop myself from becoming the sciatica guy. I think it's happened.
We need a sciatica person.
I can't get out of it now. I think in 10 years I'm still going to be the sciatica guy.
Are you happy about that, or do you feel like you want to branch out into, I don't know,
I
the
think it happened by accident. So
yeah,
remember there was a Twitter thread and then
yeah.
there was a podcast and then when I moved to America, COVID kind of froze immigration and work and everything. So I thought, well, I'll have to do something. So I'll keep on doing this sciatica thing. So it happened by accident, but I don't want to get stuck in it because I think it's kind of that obvious thing of a condition is just a condition, right? It is like endlessly interesting, and you could spend your whole life reading about it, but it's probably not the most useful way to see clinical practice is just through one condition. It feels a little bit old fashioned.
Yeah, it's a bit
Um,
yeah, you don't want to get siloed, I think.
yeah, which is
Yeah.
why I'm kind of reading this book and with kind of awe because it's pretty I've read this one obviously in some detail
Yeah.
and I've skimmed the other ones,
uh,
um, but it's kind of
oh,
uncategorizable, isn't it?
can I ask you then, because I asked this to
Mm.
Tina Price. So just to introduce to everybody. So first of all, this is the
Yeah.
book that we are looking at, and we started. Obviously, we're reading it from front to back as a group. So we started with book one, and then book one sort of like morphs into book two, and then the nerve root is at the end of that. And then obviously we're going to go into book three with the next conversation mostly. So we'll go into graded exposure. We're actually going to I'm going to be talking with Steve Robson in the next discussion, who helped edit the book and bring the book into
Yeah.
fruition in the end of Louis' illness and life, which was quite a sad and emotional journey for them, I think. But yeah, so I spoke to Tina Price about the first book and what her response was to reading it, and she was like, she said she read it like a novel. And my initial reaction, which I felt a bit embarrassed about actually afterwards, was, yeah, I sort of didn't do that. I almost came at this like a typical clinician. I was like, well, which bits am I interested in? And I'll go to that
Mm.
bit first and then read around a little bit. So I was mostly interested in things like graded exposure and like the mature organism model. Those were the things that I was really looking for. And then I sort of read the rest after that. It's interesting that you did the same, and yet Tina was like, no, it was just like a storybook for me.
Mhm. Well, my first encounter with these books was they were in the library at Northumbria University where I trained, and I graduated maybe 3 years ago or something. I'm terrible with dates. My brain doesn't work like that. Maybe about 3 years ago. And incidentally, I live just over the river from Steve Robson.
Oh yeah.
He practices where I went to high school, but I've never met him. But just a coincidence there, because I was reading the first book, and I think his note says that he wrote it in Northumberland or maybe even Prudhoe, which is where we live. Um, but I first encountered the book as an undergrad, and it was like a breath of fresh air, because I remember reading it sort of on the bus to and from uni and texting my like friends photos of all the dirty bits because he's filthy. He's filthy. And
I mean, and savage,
Yeah.
right? There are some moments in this where you're like,
he disses one or two of our esteemed colleagues. Gently disses one or two of them. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and just also quite judgmental. Oh, I just have to. So there are a few notifications I have to make. The first one is I have my daughter here who's struggling at the moment, so I will be back in 2 seconds. I'll just check what's up with her. Hey, what's up, darling? She's just painted an egg because it's obviously Easter. So we've lost a lot of our childcare. So our COVID numbers have gone up and the childcare has changed for us. So I didn't intend. So unfortunately, but also fortunately, she's here.
Can I see the egg?
Yes, this is her egg. We'll just show
that is a good egg.
You want to show it?
Yeah.
Come on then. There
is that an Easter egg?
It's it's an Easter egg. They're preparing for Easter.
That looks delicious.
Yeah, but she doesn't really know much about chocolate Easter eggs because they don't do it the same over here as they do in the UK. But
yeah.
Okay, is that all right now, Edith? Can you go and finish your lunch? Yeah. Go on then. Go and eat your dinner. And right, thank you. Sorry. So you will hear her and trolls, which is also playing in the background. It's just maybe a nice opportunity as well, just to sort of like maybe formally introduce ourselves. There's only the three of us here, so we could just, I mean, obviously, like I run Pain Geeks and I'm a physiotherapist, very interested in pain, philosophy, and sort of shouty opinions. Tom, do you want to just introduce yourself just quickly? I know you've sort of already said a little bit, but perhaps we could.
I'm also a physiotherapist from the north of England, as I said, although at the moment I'm in Texas. You can see the bottom of the flag, the map on the wall there. So my wife is American and I just kind of obediently followed her over here. And because of COVID and immigration freezing and all that stuff, I kind of was unable to practice. So I poured a lot of my attention into researching and writing about sciatica, which I think is why I'm here today. That's it really.
Yeah, and also I was posted at the same time that I was sort of like letting Pain Geeks go out into the world and talking about aches and pains. I think you were also preparing probably for the hand talk that we were, the Hogeschool and the Nijmegen talk that you were in, the International Week. And hang on. And you had made a post on Twitter that was talking about reading The Nerve Root, and I was like, oh, fantastic, somebody I know is definitely reading this book and we could have a good conversation about it. So I was really glad when you put that Twitter up, and it just so happens that quite a lot of people I think have picked up Aches and Pains this year just sort of by coincidence, which I think is also a really nice sort of thing. Mariam, do you want to introduce yourself as well? Really nice to see you as well, because I know you tried to come along we wanted to get into the last one as well, but there was some timing issues and I didn't do a good job of communicating, but I'm very glad that you're here. You're on mute. Oh, or I can't hear you. Oh no, we can't hear you.
Huh, that's weird.
Oh, can't hear you. Have you tried maybe look in your sound settings or try logging out and logging back in again? Sometimes that helps. But it's really nice to have you join along with us, Mariam. Mariam is part of the Pain Geeks platform and has been with us for a few weeks now. I think we've got about 15 or 16 weeks of reading so far. And hopefully people have been able to sort of like see how we're moving along and how things are going, and it's been cool. I've been really happy that this is happening. We've got cool people like clinicians from all over joining us. So let's come back to the book. So
can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
It was just too low. Yes, well, I'm a physiotherapist in Berlin. I've been practicing for 30 years now. I'm a Maitland trained physiotherapist. Did my course with David Butler and all the early stages when everything was just coming up. And after practicing for 10 years, I did a master's in pain management in Wales, in Cardiff, just like that, without knowing what to get into. But since then, my interest was very much in pain, also because of diverse self-experiences, cruciate ligament injuries and hip dysplasia. I just have a new hip since 1 year.
Well, congratulations. How's it going?
Yeah. And so I'm sort of knowing also a little bit of both sides. But then I came across Lorimer through David Butler. I did his course, the first one in Amsterdam, the second one was postponed. But so then I came across Le Pub, and from Le Pub I came across you, Laura. And I'm just hanging in the moment and trying to, because I just to tell you right now, I have to leave in about 50 minutes because I have to get back to work. I'm just having an intervention now. And this is where I work in my practice. I have sort of a home-based physio practice.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And I didn't get to read anything, but I've read Topical Issues of Pain. That was from, I've had from my study in pain management. I think I have 2 or 3, but and Pat Wald's last one, The Pain
Science of Suffering.
But I didn't get to read any of the aches and pains.
Well, we're going to be looking at The Science of Suffering next time as well. That is the book following this, because that's I just can't wait to read that again. So it's a totally selfish next book, really. It's lovely to have you here and your knowledge and experience as well on this topic. And topical issues in pain, I think, is so easy. It could be so easily overlooked by early career physios now. But that series was just way ahead of its time, way ahead of it.
Also, some years ago now, because I just realized that I did the master's 2003. So, but since then I've been more or less reading articles and trying to up with science. Yeah.
Cool. Really cool to have you with us. And I think I was at the Lorimer course that you were at in Amsterdam, probably bouncing around in sort of post-baby chaos. Breast pumping in between and all that sort of stuff, shipping milk home. Okay, lovely. So you were about to tell us a beautiful story, I think, Tom, about reading Aches and Pains on the bus and texting your friends. Tell us that story, if you don't mind.
Were we not recording at the time?
No, we were recording, but then I interrupted you and was my kid's doing something, and I forgot and lost where I was. That's the last bit I remember.
Oh no, I just remember there's bits because so on the bus to and from uni, and there was a little kind of maybe a club like this really of people who are particularly interested, the SWATs. And we had a little WhatsApp group, and I was just the Geeks, and I was kind of just messaging them with all kind of Louis, because he's not, one thing I remember, this is a few years ago, is he's not too shy about the way that kind of pain and pleasure are not in every way antitheses of one another, and that some people find pain quite pleasurable, and he's not too shy of kind of thinking about the whole person and all their everything we get up to. So those stuck in my head, because I think at the time, when you're at uni, you're kind of keenly reading papers that you really feel like you should be enjoying and you really feel like you should be enriched, but often all this kind of literature is very dry and boring, so I enjoyed those. But I haven't actually come back to the books until now, when I was writing my own much more modest book on nerve root pain, and I deliberately didn't read Louis' book while I was doing mine, and I finished mine before I read his, because I was very scared of I guess one of two things. The worst thing that could happen is that his was totally different to mine, and I was like, I've really got the wrong end of the stick here. But also I was worried that they would be identical, and that people would think I'd copied, or that mine would be redundant. And in the end, it's kind of somewhere, it's probably more to the latter. They're very, very similar in terms of the sources that we've used. Like he's really leaned heavily on Devore for neuropathic pain, on Adams and Dolan for disc stuff, and on Allmarker and Riedivik for the neurophysiology stuff. And they're basically the three of the cornerstones. You can't have three cornerstones. Three key things in
my illogical mind.
Three key influences on mine too. Thank you. Yeah.
It's all very, that's put us to shame, right? Yeah. But they are kind of the sort of the classic texts, really. Like you really couldn't get away from using those. I guess the interpretation perhaps might, and I haven't read your book yet, Tom, so I've been too busy with all the other stuff, but I think probably at some point it'll probably come into Pain Geeks, which is partly why I haven't been too worried about it. Yeah, I think it's the interpretation of these papers that may well be where the innovation comes, I guess, now, because we probably couldn't even repeat some of the past tests and the past investigations that were done now. So we're just going to have to keep using the same data and just trying to reimagine it, I guess, in some ways. But I don't know whether you noticed this, but I mean, obviously Louis writing this book at the end of these books at the end of his life, and you can tell, I mean, he even says in the beginning of the Nerve Route, like, I wasn't at my best when I wrote this. And so, and you can see that in the writing, it's much more clipped and perhaps not as developed as, like, say, for example, the first book and the second book, the last bit. But there is a sort of an interesting transition from, like, the sort of embodied whole person, everything is happening all the time everywhere, and then you go into the Nerve Route and it goes really, really local and and very, very reduced and very down into the sites. And it's almost like he's trying to make a statement with this, sort of saying, this is the bit we're getting wrong the most, and we need to really just spend some extra time on this. I don't know whether you had a similar feeling, or whether you noticed that too. Or...
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was one of the big anxieties in my that's what she said.
Yeah. There are several variations on the rock and roll theme. One of them ends in bitches. Sorry.
That's one of the big anxieties in my mind when I was writing mine was, is this very reductive? And I use reductive in, like, an absolutely neutral sense. I don't, it's often used as in a derogatory sense, but my book ended up being really quite reductive. And even though I try and bring it back to the clinical picture as often as I can, it's breaking things down into small pieces and using basic science and using lots of very strict definitions for words for things that are actually very complex. And so one of the things I was reassured with when I read Louis' book is that he hasn't been shy about doing the same thing. And I think it goes back to a broader thing that I got from the book is that he doesn't have too much anxiety about what he's saying. He doesn't feel very ideologically trapped in any particular place. And I think often we notice that some thinkers can get very keen on pain being a brain thing. Some thinkers can get very keen on pain being a tissues thing. Some thinkers can get very keen on the idea of complexity, or the human as a whole person, and that, that's kind of the only lens they have to look at things. And I think often if you're kind of too wedded to your own ideology, then you could read this chapter that we've just read, this part of the book that we've just read, as almost threatening. So you could say, oh, well, he's forgetting about the whole person, or he's forgetting about the brain, or he's forgetting about the complexity. But we know when we're reading Louis's book, we trust him because he not only has he written so much about that elsewhere, but he's just really cool about it. Like he doesn't feel the need to apologize. He doesn't feel the need to kind of talk around the fact that he's talking about an actual injury, that he's talking about issues in the tissues. And I think that was really refreshing, because the water I swim in, at least talking to people on Twitter, basically, is very ideologically colored now. And you feel like you have to apologize if you talk about one thing, and you have to kind of pay lip service to all the other things just to make it clear that, you know, you're not a reductive thinker. But Louis is fine with it, and that was quite inspiring. And maybe it's because he's Louis Gifford, he gets to do that. But it's interesting you should mention that, because it's definitely reductive in a neutral sense of the word.
Yeah, I got that as well. I thought it was so I was so lucky to have been taught by Prof. Mick Thacker, who does this also really beautifully, like dives very, very deep into the basic science, and then is able to contextualize that in the whole human and in the person's experiences, and also, you know, championing basic science, really, because we should, you know, they're just working on the same problem that we are. It's just that they're working on a different part of the problem, and I suppose it's that translational stuff that we need to work on, particularly as therapists, because that's the job that we have, is sort of translating the science into the human experience and how we can support that to progress. Yeah, I thought that too. And what I thought was really, I actually find that he writes about it in a really exciting way that I have never seen anybody do, really. I've never been so excited about, like, neurotransmitters and how stuff moves around the nerve.
Yeah.
But I think what I found really, like, because I finished my training 11 years ago, so we're somewhere in between, aren't we? You know, Tom, you're very early career physio, but, you know, very knowledgeable. And then Mariam, you're a bit further along in your career, and I'm somewhere in the middle. And so it's interesting because, you know, at my training, we didn't do very much on things like the biomechanics of the nerve root and, you know, back pain as a disc pathology. It was a really focused on rehabilitation of the person and very sort of goals orientated and problems based working. So then I went out and thought, oh shit, I've got to learn all this biomechanical stuff that we didn't do, and then went into sort of like Maitland's and looking at Mackenzie and trying to figure this out. And then we come into this period where it's actually, what you're saying is, maybe not all of that stuff is completely wrong, but actually now we've got new science and we might reinterpret that differently in some ways, and we might get rid of some of it in other ways. And like thinking about the sort of the way that the neuroimmune system might be functioning at that level to biomechanical stresses, which I thought was really interesting. And sort of, yeah, I don't know whether you have the same response, or because you were trained a bit later than me, so maybe it was all about the nerve root when you were trained. I don't know, Tom.
You trained in the UK?
Yeah, I trained at Northumbria University, and I graduated in 2017. Northumbria in the north of England, and it was the syllabus was kind of caught between, you know, they talk about crossing the chasm. It was kind of halfway across the chasm, depending on what tutor you had. I don't recognize, you know, when some physios complain about, you know, learning endless amounts of biomechanical minutiae. I don't recognize that at all in my syllabus. We had some stuff on pain, you know, I remember central sensitization, peripheral sensitization, and actually we had alarmingly little on anatomy, physiology. I remember for whatever reason, our lecturer was ill in the week we did the spine. And so actually in 3 years, we never once studied the spine. I think we had like one catch-up session on the spine. So really dramatically in the other direction. Yeah. And I wonder if that's part of the appeal. Like I've found a small audience of people who like to read what I write about this stuff, even though, as I mentioned earlier, the researchers I'm citing are at the very most recent 20 years old, and some of them 30, 40, 50 years old. And I wonder if some of the renewed interest in radicular pain is because of a generation like me who've been educated deliberately away from the pathoanatomy
I
and
didn't realize that.
yeah, that's certainly the part of the interest to me anyway, is that in the same way that some physios talk about discovering pain science and being, oh my God, the lights just come on. For me, actually, it was almost, not quite, but almost the other way around, is that when I finally kind of learned about the anatomy of the nerve root, I was like, that explains so much, even though it's really quite basic stuff, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I can see some of myself in that as well. And sort of like, I think that's why I ended up in pain, actually, because we had surprisingly little on pathophysiology from a musculoskeletal perspective. So we did a lot of principle-based learning around like neuro rehab and respiratory, because the head of our course was respiratory, and then the second course lead was neuro. So we had a lot of that work, and then I came out and thought, oh, I need to learn about musculoskeletal sort of like approaches to care. So I went into sort of Maitland's things like that, and then it also was like pain. I need to know about pain, and I think that's it. I think it's that kind of, we need the doorbell. we need kind of oh, it's okay, it's somebody looking for money. Edith, don't open the door, please, it's locked. They'll go away in a minute. I will. This is uncomfortable.
Now you're mute.
I think she's muted.
Yeah.
Sorry, guys. Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the differences that I think are quite interested in this. So one of the things that he started talking about in his book is this idea of adaptive versus maladaptive, and this sort of stuck out to me because I don't know how I feel about terming pain maladaptive. I don't know how we make that judgment call. And I suppose it depends which part of the medicine and the science you're working in as to how you might make that judgment call. But I was wondering if any of you had any thoughts on that idea of adaptive versus maladaptive.
I think he does. I think there's maybe three or four pages on it, so he does kind of talk it out, and it's quite a sophisticated explanation, and he kind of makes sure that he's not saying the old thing of, you know, acute pain is adaptive and chronic pain is maladaptive. So he kind of gets around some of the biggest pitfalls there, doesn't he? I can't remember if he really pays attention to all the objections. I'd be keen to hear what your objections are, but I think one of the common ones might be that maladaptive is maybe quite I don't know if it's nocebic, but quite a depressing idea that you might have kind of useless or aberrant pain, you know, like you've grown another limb or something. You've just grown this weird pain for no kind of meaningless pain for no, and I think meaning is such an important thing, that and maladaptive has this connotation of meaningless, like a kind of pointless disaster from, you know, so I think, but I think he adds enough nuance in there, doesn't he? But I kind of shared your kind of eyebrow raise when I read that bit, because it was kind of surprising, and particularly because he seems, and again, I hope I'm not misrepresenting his argument, but he seems quite keen to say that all, he would use the phrase, he doesn't say neuropathic, does he? But all nerve pain or all kind of radicular pain is maladaptive, because it's kind of so far out of proportion to what he calls almost like a little bruise in the nerve. And I think if you were being pedantic, you know, you could argue that, well, you know, probably a good deal of nerve root pain is also nociceptive. So this is kind of a distinction that Nina Schmidt's been making with nerve pain. It's also kind of nociceptive. The nerve root complex has a sleeve that's kitted out to tell us about danger, which maybe you could say was adaptive. Yeah, it's the nerves.
It's a nerve that's innervating the sheath of the nerve, so a nerve can be mechanosensitive. That was for me one of the new things.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe that would be an adaptive portion of sciatica, of radicular pain. So I guess to me, when we can talk a lot about what words are never perfect to kind of explain anything that we deal with. And to me, it often comes down to, well, is it at least useful? Does it get the job done? Does it help the patient? And I guess that just comes down to the individual patient, in my opinion. And in that case, maybe it would be useful for someone to kind of construe that pain as maladaptive. I think Louis uses the examples of, like, it's almost like a phantom limb pain in many ways, radicular pain. What were your sorry, Mariam, were you going to say something?
Sorry, because I have so
No,
many
please.
ideas popping up from my experience as a physio. Because I did my the pain management course was an interdisciplinary course that wasn't focused on physio. So I always took subjects for the assignments that were physio based, and actually I wrote my master's thesis on the upper limb tension test at that time, because I was using it after I did the courses with David Butler, but I really had no idea. And even after the master's, which was just a literature study, I didn't do any research. They were so heterogeneous that I couldn't really say, well, what is the answer in the end? And how can I say? Well, the new thing was one thing was that for me, a nerve is a tissue. It's a tissue in our body, and it can be painful. Why not? Because it has this. It's a mechanosensitive tissue. It can be, without being pathological, it can hurt, even though the nerve is healthy. I mean, if you touch your, how you say it, the music bone in Germany, you say music bone if you hit yourself.
The funny bone, this bit here.
Yeah, the one
we call it the funny bone.
Funny bone, yeah.
Yeah.
And
the music bone, that sounds nice.
Yeah, in Germany, they because you start singing from pain. And so I explain to the patients, I say, if you have a nerve that's somehow, well, I don't want to say compressed or irritated, or I always say it can't move maybe the way it wants to, and it just reacts to that. And of course, nerves have the typical ways of this burning pain or tingling. They have typical ways of expressing their uneasiness are there. But I would never say that all nerve pain is maladaptive, because the nerve has a right to hurt and to say that he's not feeling, that somewhere it's inhibited, or it's in, that I would never say. Because also acute pain, if you twisted your ankle and you limp for too long, it's maladaptive. I wouldn't say it's typical just for chronic and acute pain.
Yeah, I guess I intend to have a sort of similar sort of response, I guess, in the fact that I think that pain can never really be maladaptive. You can have maladaptive processes that may well be correlated to a high level of pain or not. But I don't know I don't know how I feel about pain as an experience being judged as adaptive or maladaptive, but I can understand that there are maladaptive processes, or there are processes that may exist within the neuroimmune cascade that are serving to, I don't know, upregulate what's going on in the local area, in that sort of like coordination of physiology, that might not always be helpful, and there are some tissues that perhaps just have more capacity, more opportunity to send a louder message than other tissues. And so I guess that's how I think what Louis is sort of saying about the nerve is that, you can a small amount of irritation or stimulation around the nerve can produce this massive cascade, or these big and quite powerful mediators within the system, much more so than, say, for example, gross tissue like muscle or joint or ligament. But then again, I don't know if that even in itself is accurate, because there's no separation, is there, between muscle, joint, ligament and nerve. It's just when the injury itself is on the nerve structure or on the nerve tissue, we get a different response than when the injury is being transmitted through the nervous system. And I think that's that's what's happening. So I guess to me, that's not necessarily maladaptive. It's actually incredibly adaptive, because it's, I guess, what it's saying is the means by which other information travels through the system is now under some stress itself, and therefore something serious could happen if we don't pay the correct attention to this, physiologically or cognitively, whatever that is. And so I guess in a way that makes sense that you've got this kind of hierarchy within the tissue structures, because this is the means by which somatosensory information is being processed. That seems like a really important job. I guess if we're thinking hierarchically, I can see why that would be adaptive, but it's just that it really fucking hurts when it happens.
But with the nerve, I would always differentiate if the nerve is pathological in itself, in its conduction, like with the neuropathy, polyneuropathy, or if it's even with a herniated disc pressing on the spinal nerve, then there's an inflammation, and of course there's a reaction. But once everything is healed, hopefully, then the nerve would recuperate and be healthy again, so it won't stay damaged. So I think I in my logic, I always differentiate if it's if the nerve is healthy or not, and if it's just as a tissue, as a structure, if it's somehow impeded and reacting through pain.
That's it though, isn't it? So that is the nerve healthy or unhealthy? That is sort of running parallel to this adaptive and maladaptive. Mm-hmm. And actually the response that we're seeing in a nerve that has some kind of assault on it, that's saying, whoa, something's going, that is a healthy response. That's what we, I suppose the nerve is, do we consider the nerve unhealthy because it's having a physiological response to its environment? And I don't know. These are all the sorts of, this is what the words say, I guess. The person may well be in ill health because they're experiencing pain, but is the tissue unhealthy?
I think it's maybe to kind of back up Louis' argument a little bit, and to maybe throw my hat in the ring with maladaptive a bit more, is this distinction between as Mariam said, that the nerves of the nerves, that and nerves as being tissues that are able to signal that they're not happy to the brain, where we kind of see people with sensitive nerves, sometimes it's called like mechanosensitivity, and Louis kind of calls that nerve ending pain. So that on the one hand, but then what Louis calls axon pain on the other hand, or what I would call like ectopic pain. And on the other hand, that kind of, so when the nerve is injured to the extent that receptors bunch up, as you both know, but for the benefit of the audience, bunch up in the axon, and then kind of cause action potentials to start from the axon of the nerve, where they're definitely not supposed to come from. And I remember talking to Anina, and she was quite emphatic, and I think the word she uses, that's absolutely pathological. And so I think if with the kind of still feeling like maladaptive maybe is an odd word for it, I think you could maybe argue that is like a different, it's another step, it's like a different category from kind of a nerve appropriately telling the brain that it's not happy when it starts to fire off those action potentials in a way that physiologically I don't think we were ever supposed to do that. I just think it's a flaw of the system that happens.
Exactly. For example, one parameter could be, is the nerve able to heal itself? For example, after a nerve root compression, it could heal and be healthy again. Or is it something like the myelin sheath is being, like with MS or with diabetes, polyneuropathies, they will never get healthy again. So that for me is a pathology, but not necessarily a maladaptation, because the nerve it's his fault that that somebody has diabetes, and so I don't think the maladaptation is really, because it's not a choice.
Yeah, I like that distinction, and I think these these things are, I think they're important when we're thinking about how we frame these things to, you know, that to people who are experiencing this, like pathology versus maladaptive. There are two very different meanings associated with those things. And yeah, it's, I mean, I sort of find that I flip between the two. When I read it in Louis, I'm like, yeah, and then I sit back and I think, but do I really think that? And yeah, but I think it's an interesting conversation, and I think that there are times when, you know, pathological states of the human can affect how many tissues are being sort of physiologically maintained, and that one of those changes in how the tissue is being physiologically maintained may well be is in the nerve as well, and in the nervous tissue too, but equally across systems. So it's not necessarily that the nerve is the isolated problem. Yeah, I don't know. I always think, it just made me think a bit. I do want to talk a little bit also about, and I know we've not got much time left, so I'm thinking about things that really sort of I always found quite interesting, sort of this idea of the difference between neuropathy and neuropathic pain, or radiculopathy and radicular pain, and, you know, like, and then the idea that you know, you can have a space occupying lesion, and you can have changes within the foraminal space, is that right? And that can in itself, just chemical changes within that could be giving us these radicular pains or neuropathic type symptoms. How do we as clinicians, like, how do we navigate that space? And I think what the book does really well is sort of give us a bit of a roadmap as to, well, you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be that something is being pressed or squeezed or entrapped, which is the view I grew up with as a physio. But it could well be that there's just an alteration in the sort of inflammatory soup that's in that area, that could be because of some biomechanical or pathoanatomical change further up or lower down. Did you find that also a bit like liberating or confusing? Or, I mean, I know you've sort of been thinking about this for the last couple of years, Tom.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in there. First, you mentioned kind of the different words that we have for all this stuff, and I think if you caught me a couple of years ago, I would have been quite pedantic about the different words that we use, just as but I think as my understanding has developed, I'm a lot more relaxed about what words we apply to what, because as I mentioned before, I recognize that reality is very complex, and words just carve it up at its joints, and you kind of just men, it is men, or have just chosen where to carve it up, and so I'm kind of more relaxed about the fact that, for example, sciatica doesn't really mean much, and neuropathy is very vague. I think it means different things to different people, but probably just the way it has to be. And I think if anything, the danger is to be too specific. So I think if we're really specific about what neuropathic pain means, then you can get yourself into a world where you think you're labeling something and describing something, and you're understanding it more than you actually are, probably. A bit of a meandering answer. But then to kind of answer the second part of your question, I think for me, and this goes back to what we were talking about before, it's almost kind of having to correct myself in the opposite direction. So I grew up and was trained, I think maybe at the height of explain pain type enthusiasm. And with that, all the kind of attendant misinterpretations that come with explain pain. And I was definitely not totally naive, but probably made the error of sticking with the binary thinking. And okay, so maybe if the MRI doesn't really show us the back pain, then the back pain must be from something in the brain, And so I developed this thing of talking about like centralized pain and things like that. So even as a student, kind of that was the world I was in. And actually I would have been probably socialized to say that, well, obviously the nerve isn't compressed because pain is an output of the brain, and compression and MRI doesn't matter to back pain. So actually I kind of made the opposite journey to maybe what you're describing, Laura, where I was kind of learning and admitting to myself that actually very often the nerve is compressed. And as you said, very often the disc itself is kind of inflammatory to the nerve. So Louis talks about how it's not being seen by the body. So when it kind of jumps out, it's like new to the body, and the body kind of freaks out and sets off an immune inflammatory response. He doesn't talk about, I'm rambling now, this is the last point I'll make, but as far as I can see, so he kind of leans very heavily on this idea of the disc being an autoimmune kind of insult to the nerve. And the other explanation for that is that the disc is not, it's not that the disc is a foreign object that is then exposed to the immune system that causes an immune inflammatory reaction, but that the disc itself is contains pro-inflammatory cytokines. So especially as they degenerate more and more, the inflammation builds up inside the disc, almost like a magma underneath a volcano, and then it all comes out. So it's already inflamed when it arrives. I don't think Louis mentions that. And when I was trying to work out like what the truth is between these two arguments, and basically it seems like the literature is not really that decided or even that developed, to be honest. I suppose it's not really the number one problem for biomedicine, so there's not like a lot of money or time being spent on it. But just to kind of finish my ramble, that was kind of because as I was reading, I was trying to think like, well, what have I written about that he hasn't included? And I think maybe that was one of the few things there. But yeah.
Could I say something? Yeah. Let me see if I can. To the disc. So Louis says that the disc starts when it starts degenerating, that it builds up these cytokines, and that could be like affecting the nerve root.
So as I hope I'm not misrepresenting, but I think Louis says the other theory, which is that the disc it's like the autoimmune theory. So it's this idea that the disc is like the inside of the eyeball, like the rest of the body, the immune system has never seen it before. Because it's not innervated, as you know, and doesn't have blood vessels beyond the first couple of millimeters. So when the disc herniates, it's almost like a foreign substance for the body. And that's what Louis says. And I was trying to say that, well, actually, there's this other argument there that actually it's just inherently inflammatory.
Okay. For example, to that argument, from my experience, I learned that usually you have disc herniations when you're younger, because it's usually a trauma, and that's when there's still enough nucleus to come out. But when you're over 50, you're drying out, and the disc starts getting dry, and then you just have the normal degenerative processes that of course can also maybe push on a nerve root, but usually because it happens so slowly, the nerve root just adapts. I've seen MRIs where the myelin, the I say the not the cervical spine, the what's inside the where the spinal nerves are coming from, this the how you could say the myelin. Well, anyway, that the nerve tissue can really, if the degeneration happens slowly, they can just adapt and really have, make movements and say, wow, how can that person move? And they move because it happens slowly. So it's always when it happens quick and there's an inflammation that the nerve root reacts. So that's to that point. I was just, I don't think that, I wouldn't agree with that because that would mean that every degeneration gives all these symptoms, and people, not every old person, not all old people have back pain. And that was just to that subject. And what another thought was that when we just said nerve root pain or radiculopathy. I just thought there are some words that define where the symptom is, and the others say how the mechanics are for the disease or for the. So I think that's also a differentiation. Some just describe it as pain, nerve root pain. That just says where it is. It doesn't say nothing about how it happens. So that's why there's so many words. I think, yeah, the patient doesn't matter. He doesn't care anyway. They just want to get rid of the pain. But for us, of course, because of our how we reason, it's better, of course, to have an idea.
I mean, yeah, it's always difficult, isn't it, when we attribute a tissue to pain, because obviously pain doesn't work like that. It's we cannot like say that because the nerve is, because we have these symptoms, it's definitely nerve pain, or because we see these things happening in the nerves, that's what's causing the pain. So we have this stuff happening in the nerve, and we have these symptoms, and then we have pain, and then we call that pain, and that's a full sort of a whole human sort of coded and body. But then I'm a fan of complexity theory, so that would be my my bias there as well, that, you know, whatever we're seeing in the local tissues, if it's producing pain, it's producing pain across the systems, and that is. But the question is, are there particular substratification, like are there ways of subcategorizing types of pain, or types of symptoms that show up as pain, as giving us some idea as to where the pathological tissue or the unhelpful processes or are happening, I guess. And I suppose that's what they're trying to say. And that's the hard part with things like radiculopathy and radicular pain, is because they're used intertwined. They're so often used as the same thing, but yet they're not. So if we're really thinking what radiculopathy is and what radicular pain is, they're two very different sort of experiences and pathologies. So I guess, yeah, that's also something that I thought this book did really well at explaining why we probably and why it's important that we know the difference as well, and also that we can feel comfortable in the fact that maybe we can't necessarily see a lesion, but there is the symptoms of that are being produced, and it might be because of these chemical changes that are happening in the local areas that's changing how that tissue is transmitting and transducing, which I thought was that was a really nice thing for physiotherapists that are trying to make sense of that. I thought he did that really well. And then I know we're really running out of time, but I really wanted to talk about the guy with the fishing needle and that weird pain, because in my clinic, this is and I'm sure in your clinics as well, this is the sort of stuff that I'm just like, I just don't understand why your pain shows up like this. And I keep coming back to, so the feel like this, and when if you do ever get a chance to read the book, Mariam, it's a really interesting example. And I don't know if I can find it just off the top of my, I did fold the page down, so I might be able to find it. And it says something like, take a big needle, like the ones we use to mend the fishing nets, thread it up with some steel wire, like the wire traces we use to catch a shark. Now start sewing in here, out here, in here, out here, all the way down. I'm on page 714. And then it's sort of like going, so he's almost showing him this stitching all the way down, and I think it's the border of the scapula. Down the medial border of the scapula, down to its tip, and then back up the lateral border. So the wire's got an end sticking out here on the upper medial scapula, and then an end sticking down here at the other end, and you just grab them and pull them and then drag them to and fro, and that's what his pain feels like. And it's just so interesting to me, this, because I'm so fascinated by the words people use to describe their experience of pain, the experience itself and how that's being coordinated, and then the physiology underneath it. And I'm like, how? Because that experience for him is so culturally relevant to him, right? He's a fisherman, so he can imagine this. This is a potential experience within his whole predictive capacity of experience, this wide potential of experience. This is something that sits within, doesn't sit at all within mine, so I can't even imagine what that would feel like. But for him, it's visceral, it's his experience of it. And I keep thinking, how does this firing of nerves in that man or that person produce that feeling, but yet in me it might produce something completely culturally different, and I might explain it and then how on earth do we use the explanation of pain as an assessment mechanism for things like neuropathic pain? Like, how do we know, like, how do we unpick all of that? Go.
You mean, how would you explain it to a fisherman and to somebody else?
What is the science that's going on there? Like, how is this happening? And how do we think we can understand the mechanism based on how a person tells us it feels, when how a person tells us it feels is so culturally relevant to them and their experiences? And I just was blown away by that, because I see that so often in my clinic, and I'm like, I mean, there's definitely some nerve stuff going on, because there's always something nervy happening in pain, because that's literally how it's being moved around, and there's something immune going on here.
And that's like the kind of, I sometimes think of like this, explaining someone who has like a painful radiculopathy, and explaining it to them. Often there's kind of 3 steps or 3 things to cover, isn't there? And one is the fact that the nerve is kind of irritated, so it's firing off too many action potentials, not in those words, but they get pain. And one is that the nerve is also a little bit damaged or swollen, so it's not doing its job right, just like a swollen ankle won't move properly, so it's not firing them up and down, so it feels numb. And then the third one is trying to explain all these weird feelings, and why does it feel like running water down my leg, or there's ants on my foot? And generically, I sometimes say it's a bit like a detuned radio will play white noise, especially like pins and needles and tingling. That often kind of gets often is like a penny drop moment. So when the nerve is irritated, it starts firing off all sorts of unnecessary junk information to the brain, and it sort of feels like white noise, like pins and needles, tingling. But then you get these really specific sensations, and sometimes complex sensations, like so pins and needles is kind of not easy, but it's kind of, you think of it as like A beta fibers just kind of exploding, and it just kind of feels a bit like pins and needles. But then complex sensations like running water requires like a very specific sort of combination of neurons firing. I can't remember exactly what it is, but you need cold neurons to tell you it's water, and you need and so I often, the only way I kind of understand it is that if you think of a nerve in cross section, then it contains populations of neurons that are designed to do certain jobs. And when the nerve is injured, they don't all fire, but some of them fire because they're more injured than others. And if the ones that are firing happen to be fairly similar to the ones that fire when you're out for a picnic and ants start crawling over your foot, then all those signals that are similar enough to the signals that happen when ants crawl over your foot will be interpreted by the brain like there's ants crawling all over your foot. And I think it's the brain probably does most of the work there in my like very crude model of the nervous system. I don't think it's like literally the same sort of what's the word, like the same rhythm and the same but I think it has to be like the population of neurons, but also the right kind of cadence and rhythm of the firing and things. And if it's similar enough, like you'll know more about predictive processing than me, Laura, but the brain only knows how to feel certain things already, right? We don't have a feeling for nerve injury. We just have a feeling for pain, ants crawling, running water, and maybe a fishing hook. And so the brain does the rest of the work, is how I understand it anyway.
Question: if when your arm falls asleep or your leg falls asleep, there's a similar tingling. Mm-hmm. And I once asked a medical doctor, a patient of mine, I said, what is the difference between when you squeeze your arm or you sleep like this and it starts tingling, or if you say it's this nerve tingling, because it feels actually the same. And he said, well, if the blood flow is inhibited, the nerve also gets less circulation, and that's why the nerve is reacting to the ischemia, or and that's and that's why the nerve also gives the same sensation, but because different reason, because it's not getting enough blood. But that, I thought that was interesting because it's the same tingling. So I don't know why a nerve tingles. What's the mechanics behind that? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that it's the nerve isn't necessarily giving you the sensation. The nerve is firing, and that sensation is being coordinated into a conscious experience based on prior experience of similar mechanisms firing and what they might have meant before. I guess if your nerve is being fired like because of some internal sort of inflammatory state, and it's giving off those similar mechanisms, then the prior already exists. This is ants, this already exists. And if the weighting is towards the prior, then that's the experience you'll get. Even if you look at your arm and you can see that that's not what's happening, the weighting of what information is it going to work most on, the stuff you've already picked up over time, or the error that you can produce by looking at your arm and saying, but there aren't ants on it, but yet the prior is weighted, so the sensation will still be coordinated and you'll still experience that as a person, even though sensorially you can say it's not what's happening. But yeah, and I've probably made 101 mistakes there in trying to explain predictive processing. Not trying to explain predictive processing, but trying to apply it. So let's just hope
Actually,
I get corrected soon.
I have to start get going because I have to get ready for my next sessions. But I spontaneously decided just to hang on for 1 hour at least.
Yeah,
really nice.
We're so glad you did, and hopefully you come to the next one and many more as we go on over the year. So,
and I'm sure I'm going to contact you again, Laura. I just want to make some comments about your Pain Geek.
Yes, that would be lovely.
I'll just write an email.
Yes, please do, and please, and if you want me to send you my email, just put it a comment somewhere, and I'll send you my email address if you haven't got it. Otherwise, do please get in touch.
Yeah, okay, because I think I just have the one from your Pain Geek, but not
you can send it to that one. That's absolutely fine. Yeah. Okay, lovely to see you. Thank you for joining.
Nice to meet you, Mariam. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Tom. Bye.
Yeah, I think actually on that note, we probably should come to an end, really. I mean, I could probably talk to you for hours, I think, Tom. I think we've got loads of overlapping interests, and it would be lovely to sort of see where they are, and yeah, have another chat maybe at some point in the future. It's been really fun. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I agree. We could have gone on for a lot longer. I feel like we just went into a museum and just like zoomed in on one or two, paintings, but there's so much more to talk about. And the conversation, I think if we had it 10 different times, it would be totally different every time. So there's definitely like a lot more territory there. But thanks for inviting me, and do invite me again if it's kind of overlaps with anything that I might know about.
Well, we're all about pain, and that seems to be your area. So whether you like it or not, you seem to be weighing in on the conversation. And there's a lot to talk about there.
But like I say, thank you, and I hope you enjoy this. What is it? The Pat Wall book, which actually I bought that a few years ago and never got around to reading it. I left it in England actually.
Oh no!
But it's kind of one of those things I really need to read as well. You've read it before, have you?
Yeah. So I mean, I studied under Mick about 7 years ago, and of course, like you can't do anything with Mick without being introduced to Pat's work in an emotional way. So you want to read his actual words that he felt free and liberated to write in the way he wanted to write, rather than just in an article. And but yeah, it's a really nice book. I mean, it was written a long time ago. These books were, I mean, even Louis' book now, it was written seemingly, I mean, it wasn't a long time ago, was it? I think it's only, what, 7 years ago, 6 years ago,
That's the funny
something
thing
like
is,
that.
I thought it was much older than it was.
2014, yeah.
I
7
thought it was a
years.
much older book than it was, but it's not an old book at all. And he wrote it when I was in uni. Like, it's not old, but there's a weird thing where something about it feels old, but it's not because of the content or the science that he's using. And it might just be because it's something I've noticed often, which is the older the text, the more free the writer feels to just say what they think. So a lot of the really kind of interesting papers in sciatica are old. They're from the 50s, 40s, 30s even. And it's because the writers were kind of for whatever reason felt more liberated to say what they saw, and B, didn't have a problem writing it down, either. They didn't feel like they had to conform to any particular journalistic standards or put too much jargon in or boring introductions that everyone skips and stuff. And so I think Louis's text feels old for that reason, is because he's writing in quite a liberated, open way, which is quite rare now. So I was surprised when I saw that it was 2013 for that reason, I think.
Yeah. It's the culmination of all of his life's work, isn't it? It's like, okay, bottom line, cards on the table, this is where I'm at with physiotherapy. And it's also a massive call to action, like, now somebody do this research, somebody look into this, somebody go into this was my thoughts here, like there's more work to be done here. And you read it and you can't help but feel like, wow, I'm part of this next generation of people that are thinking about pain and looking at pain particularly from a physiotherapy profession, because we've done some pretty awesome things over the years as physios, like in terms of opening up the conversation of pain, and rightly so, because it's our bread and butter, really. We should be on the forefront of this conversation. Disappointing sometimes that we're not as much as we could be, I think. But I feel like that as well, like it really is a kind of closing off the circle, just giving everything that he's got now to the community, and what an incredible gift it was. And it's yeah, I know what you mean. And like you look at the mature organism model, I think it's really cool, the mature. And I think some of what's happening, that sort of that idea of the body doesn't know the nucleus pulposus because it's not been exposed to it before, so it's never sampled it before, so the sampling hasn't happened, and then obviously it comes out, and then the body samples it for the first time, and it's like, whoa, shit, what is that? That's an intense bit of mush, that, and it sort of has a bit of a freak out from that. And I can understand, because it's not that it's a foreign object, it's just that it's not been there before and it's new, right? So it has the ability to recognize all of the chemicals that's in there, which is why it can respond to them. It just wasn't there before. I think that's what's happening in all inflammatory responses, isn't it? But yeah, it's a really it's an interesting book. I'm glad we started with this one, because it sort of sets the scene, really, because I think it's quite radical for its time, but it's also there's stuff that we could take on from here, and that's what Mick is doing right now, I think, moving on the predictive processing model and sort of taking the sort of the framework of bits of the mature organism model, and then seeing what we can move across into predictive processing and embodied cognition, and that's exciting. So lovely, you're in America, and I hope you're safe over there. It looks pretty crazy at the moment in some times, or certainly you've had a busy last year on American soil. We're having a busy this year on European soil, so but stay safe and look after yourself, and and hope that things are all right.
Thanks, Laura. It was good to meet you, as I say. Finally, it looks like maybe things are finally almost going to become safer in America than they are in Europe, with the way the vaccines are going. So, I hope that kind of doesn't get any worse than it is. It's just a depressing way to put it, but I think I'm kind of holding on to the vaccine stuff in America and in England, because it's like the first good bit of news that's happened for me. And obviously I've been worried about my parents for a long time.
Yeah.
But then then I start to feel guilty about it, because it's basically those are the only two countries where it's so good. So anyway, I hope, you mentioned your grandparents or in-laws.
Yeah.
Grandparents-in-law, is that a phrase? Parents-in-law.
Parents-in-law. Yeah.
Children's grandparents. Cool.
Yeah.
Are there.
Yeah.
So I hope they're safe too.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, well, I will press stop recording and that will be the end of this. So thank you very much.
Take care, Laura.